Hello, and welcome to your lecture on Japanese internment camps. Grab your student notes and use them to follow along and fill in any blanks that you missed in class. I'd like to begin this lecture by reading you an excerpt from the book Journey to Topaz. This book is a true story based on the author's own experiences as a child. She describes how, after her family was forced to register with the government, her father, who was innocent of all wrongdoing, was suddenly arrested by 2 policemen and sent to an internment camp. Not too long after that, this girl learned that she and her family had 10 days to pack, store, or sell everything they owned, including their beloved family dog. Now they've been loaded up into buses and are headed out who knows where. As they got off the bus, they were directed to an area roped off beneath the grandstand, where each family registered, filled out forms, and went through a brief medical inspection. The baggage they carried was inspected for contraband. Contraband are forbidden items. And then they were assigned living quarters. Barrack 16, apartment 40, Ken read from the slip handed to him. Golly, Yuki said, impressed. We get an apartment. She had never lived in an apartment and found the prospect intriguing. She moved eagerly now, keeping close to Ken. Hey, Ken! It was Ken's classmate, Jim Hirai. Hey, Jim! Ken shouted back, and they pouted each other on the back as though they hadn't seen each other for 10 years. I'll help you find your quarters, Jim offered. But now Mother was surrounded by her church friends who had arrived 2 days earlier. She was bowing and greeting them as though they were meeting on the sunny walk outside their church. They quickly exchanged barrack numbers, and their friends promised to come visit them later. I am in the bachelor's quarters here, one man said rather dismally. I must share a room with 5 other men. It is a strange new life, he added. He did not look happy. Yuki was anxious to see where they would be living. Come on, Mama, she urged, and they quickly followed Ken and Jim down the racetrack. It had rained the night before, and the track was muddy and pocked with puddles. Yuki's new saddle shoes were soon covered with mud, and Mother's blue kid shoes were oozing with it. I'm glad I packed rubber boots for us, she remarked, and she held on to Yuki's arm to keep from slipping. As they walked along, Yuki saw that wherever there was room, tar-papered army barracks had been put up for the 8,000 people who would soon be living there. Barrack 16, however, was not among them. Now Ken and Jim were leaving the northern end of the track and disappearing beyond a cluster of eucalyptus trees. When Yuki and Mother caught up with them, they were going up the wide ramp of a stable that stood about a foot above the ground. There was a sign tacked to the corner of the stable that read, Barrack 16. This isn't a barrack at all, Yuki said, disappointed. It's just a dirty old stable. They followed Ken and Jim along the narrow walk that took them past a dozen stalls, each marked with a number, and then stopped in front of the one marked 40. Well, this is it, Jim said, nudging the door open. The stall was narrow and dark, with 2 small windows high up on either side of the door. It measured about 10 by 20 feet and was empty except for 3 army cots that lay folded on the floor. There were no mattresses or bedding of any kind. Dust and dirt and wood shavings still littered the linoleum that had been hastily laid over the manure-covered floor, and Ken sniffed at the lingering odor left by the former occupants. Boy, he said, wrinkling his nose, there's no mistaking who lived here before us. Yuki looked around the stall, feeling as though she'd been handed an empty ice cream cone. This is an apartment? She asked, dismayed. That, my dear child, is what is known as a euphemism, Jim said to her. You'll get used to things like that here. Citizens who had done nothing wrong, arrested by police and sent to internment camps without a fair trial. Citizens stripped of their rights, forced to leave behind everything they had ever known and go live in horse stalls. What country does this sound like to you? If your answer is the United States, then I regret to inform you that you are correct. Between the years 1942 and 1946, between 110,000 and 120,000 Japanese American citizens were forced by the United States government to leave everything behind and go live behind barbed wire in internment camps. These are the Japanese internment camps, and they are one of the most shameful and yet one of the most inspiring events in American history. In order to understand why the internment camps happened, you have to take a brief look at the history of racism in the United States. Racism is, of course, the belief that people of some skin colors are superior, they're simply better, and people of other skin colors are inferior, they're simply worse. Most of the most famous racist events in American history center around African Americans. You have slavery before the Civil War, segregation and lynching after the Civil War. But there is also a long history of racism against Asians in the United States. Throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, laws were passed to limit or outright prohibit immigration from Asian countries into the United States. For the immigrants that did manage to arrive here, they were not allowed to naturalize or to become American citizens, no matter how loyal or sincere they were. Those immigrants had children. Those children were American citizens because they were born on U.S. soil, and yet other laws prevented them from going to the same schools as white children and from marrying white Americans. In other words, even though they're United States citizens, they were treated as second-class citizens, and many people viewed them with dislike and suspicion. Now, enter Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and Americans are furious. Of course they are. Any country is going to be angry when another country bombs them. But there was another element, because the country that bombed Pearl Harbor was Japan. Japan was an Asian nation. In the United States, the Japanese people were viewed with dislike and with suspicion. And so the events at Pearl Harbor ended up fanning racist hysteria across the United States. Anyone who looked even remotely Japanese was suspected of being a spy. And if someone protested and said, "Hey, look, I'm an American citizen. I was born here. I was raised here. I'm very loyal to my country," the response would be a viper is a viper, whether the egg is hatched in Japan or in America. In other words, people of Japanese descent are by nature venomous snakes, and it doesn't matter where they're born and raised, they will try to bite you when they can. Propaganda at the time portrayed the Japanese as rats, as lice, as vermin to be exterminated. Do those things sound familiar? Those same sorts of images were used in Nazi Germany to dehumanize the Jews. They were used in the United States to dehumanize the Japanese, and it is, sadly, perhaps no surprise then, that on February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order Number 9066, which enabled the military to create zones from which certain persons could be excluded. These zones ended up being pretty much the entire west coast of the United States, which is where most Japanese and Japanese Americans lived, and the people who were excluded were the Japanese. In many cases, they were only given a matter of days to sell everything they owned or find someone or some place to store it for an indefinite period of time before they had to evacuate and were sent to internment camps, relocation centers. Technically, and this was a term that was used at the time, they were concentration camps, using the traditional term that a concentration camp is a small, relatively small area where a large group of people, usually prisoners of war or members of a persecuted minority, are forced to live, usually with inadequate facilities. And that definition perfectly describes the Japanese internment camps. But it is important to note when using loaded terms like concentration camps that these were not the Nazi death camps. Japanese Americans were not exterminated. The purpose of the camps was to strip Japanese Americans of their civil liberties and imprison them, not to kill them. The camps themselves were hastily built. After all, the United States had not been planning on housing 120,000 people on short notice. The insulation was poor, a problem when you consider the fact that these camps were located in really hostile landscapes, in deserts or deep in mountains, where it get really, really hot or really, really cold, or there'd be terrible dust storms. The food was poor. People had to stand in line for a long time to get any of it, too. Stand on long lines for the bathroom as well. There were inadequate medical facilities and inadequate supplies for things like schools. There were schools. They were staffed by Japanese Americans who volunteered to teach there, but the students had to work on the floor because often there were no desks. And people lived in these conditions for 4 years, from 1942 to 1946, although the first camps did start closing in 1945. There were attempts to challenge the relocation in courts. It's blatantly unconstitutional, after all. And yet, each one of these attempts failed. Each time someone went to court and said, look, you cannot take American citizens and go force them to live in camps, the court said, I don't really think it's that bad an idea. And the relocation stood. It was not until 1988 that the United States government formally apologized for the relocation camps and paid some reparations to the people who are still alive. It was not until 2006 that many of the actual photographs of the internment camps were declassified by the United States government. The pictures in the pictures folder that I put up on the general overview, if you've been taking this class 13, 14 years earlier, you would not be allowed to see many of those pictures. They would still be classified by the United States government. You can see why the Japanese internment camps were one of the most shameful events in American history. But do you remember how I said they're also one of the most inspiring? Throughout American history, there have been many examples of courage and wisdom in the face of crisis. And the Japanese Americans in the internment camps provide one of those shining examples. Faced with a terrible situation, stripped of their civil liberties, forced to leave behind everything they'd ever known and move to crowded camps with terrible conditions, these courageous Americans made the best of it. They turned those camps into communities. Together, they formed schools and churches and baseball teams. They wrote newspapers, raised crops, raised animals. They did their best to make camp life into normal life. And desperate to prove their loyalty to their country, many Japanese Americans signed up to go to war. More than 16,000 Japanese Americans served as soldiers in World War II and ended up being some of the most highly decorated soldiers in that war. When we look for examples of how hatred and fear can lead to terrible decisions, even in freedom-loving countries, we need look no further than the Japanese internment camps. When, however, we look for inspiring examples of resilience and resourcefulness in the face of terrible conditions, we need look no further than the brave American citizens who lived in those camps. I will see you next week.